Imagine your child just wants to go to school, but is being ostracized by the community because he doesn't fit their perfect image. This is not fiction. This is my father and I's fight to regain our right to exist. And this is how we stand up against injustice to regain our right to exist in our own home. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Now let's explore the story. Every morning I watch my son Ethan prepare for the day with unwavering perseverance and determination. At 15 years old, Ethan has already overcome more challenges than any child I know. Diagnosed with muscular dystrophy at a young age, he has grown up strong-willed, never letting his wheelchair define him. I always tell myself that Ethan is more than just a special child. He is a fighter, a scientific genius, and someone who has never let adversity hold him back from his dreams. When my wife passed away 5 years ago, I promised her that I would do everything I could to make sure our son not only survived, but truly lived. I left my busy job in New York and moved to Willow Creek, Texas, a peaceful community where Ethan could be treated as a normal person. We chose this place because we believe in kindness, respect, and togetherness. The green lawns, tree-lined streets, children's laughter, and friendly neighbors convinced me that here, Ethan's wheelchair was just a tool, not a barrier. The first few days at Willow Creek were picturesque. Ethan quickly settled into his new school. The teachers were enthusiastic, and the bus driver, Mr. Wilson, was a kind man who patiently helped Ethan get on and off the bus. Every morning, my father and I followed a familiar routine, waking up at 5:30, Ethan taking his medication, doing physical therapy, eating breakfast, and going to school. To outsiders, it seemed like a complicated process, but to us, it was a rhythm that had been perfected over time. I was always proud to see Ethan confidently maneuvering his wheelchair, eager to face the new day without any self-consciousness or hesitation. But I was naive to think that everyone in this community shared my views on inclusion. While many of my neighbors were friendly, I began to notice strange looks and forced smiles as Ethan walked by. The initial greetings became less frequent, and the brief conversations at the door gradually disappeared. At first, I ignored it, thinking that people were simply busy with their own lives, but then the signs became more obvious. At first, anonymous notes appeared on my doorstep, polite but unkind. Please ensure wheelchairs do not block public walkways. Please provide separate drop-off and pick-up services to avoid traffic disruption. I ignored them, thinking they were just misunderstandings. But then, neighbors grew quiet as I approached, eyes averted, voices whispered behind my back. I began to hear about a woman who held absolute power in the neighborhood, who viewed the HOA not as a community organization, but as her own personal empire. Linda Matthews, president of Willow Creek's HOA, is not the kind of person you want to make enemies of. A former executive with clear political ambitions, she sees the neighborhood not as a community but as a platform for her career. She has reportedly spent years cultivating an image of Willow Creek as a model neighborhood, one that is clean, orderly, and no trouble. What I didn't realize was that, to Linda, Ethan's wheelchair was more than just a means of transportation. It was a problem that needed to be eliminated. But I didn't know that until one March morning, a morning that started out like any other until Linda showed up at my door, clipboard in hand and a calculating expression. That was the moment I realized Ethan and I not only lived in this neighborhood, we were its targets. I will never forget that morning when I realized that Linda Matthews was not just a powerful person, but someone who would sacrifice everything, including humanity, for political ambition. She appeared at my door, clipboard clutched in her hand, her lips pursed into a fake smile, as if she had spent hours practicing in front of the mirror. Her eyes were unfriendly, cold, calculating, and full of hidden meaning. Linda Matthews is the kind of person who, at a glance, you can tell is not used to rejection. A former executive with a track record of success, she has served as president of Willow Creek's HOA for nearly a decade. To new residents, she is a model of leadership, speaking eloquently at events, smiling at the press when the neighborhood is honored. But behind that facade, there is a truth that not everyone dares to speak. Linda does not lead for the community, but uses it as a tool to polish her name, gradually moving up the political path that has been mapped out. And in the picture of perfection Linda was trying to paint, Ethan was the one blemish she couldn't erase. I don't know when she started seeing my son's presence as a problem. Maybe it started when she decided to run for city council. Linda wanted to make Willow Creek a model of neighborhood management, a campaign highlight. She wanted clean streets, green lawns, magazine-perfect homes. At HOA events, she wanted a model community without any problems that might tarnish her public. In Linda's eyes, the dedicated bus that stopped in front of my house every morning was a minus for her campaign, while the hydraulic lift allowed Ethan to get on and off safely and without causing any inconvenience. To Linda, it was a beautification of the perfect neighborhood she was promoting. Vague reminders of morning traffic quickly turned into specific complaints. The bus is congested, the lift is too noisy, the neighborhood is not suitable for special vehicles. I knew who was behind it. But Linda had never confronted me directly until that morning. "We need to talk," Linda said, her voice unkind. I stood on the steps, my hands on the doorframe, feeling the tension. "I've had a lot of complaints about the morning traffic. Your son's bus is causing inconvenience to the neighbors, and it's time to find another solution." She made it sound like a reasonable request, but I knew this wasn't a discussion. It was an ultimatum. I wanted to retort, to insist that Ethan's bus had never caused any inconvenience, that any driver could adjust the speed in seconds, but I knew that to Linda the truth didn't matter. All she cared about was her image, and Ethan was an irrelevant detail in the story she was telling. I looked directly at Linda and understood that this was not just about a bus, but about the right to exist openly in this community. Would Ethan be considered a normal part of the neighborhood, or should he be hidden so as not to disrupt the perfect picture Linda was building? She didn't say it directly, but her eyes said it all. She didn't care about Ethan. She only cared about how my son's presence affected her own career path. I felt a simmering anger in my chest as Linda continued to talk about reasonable solutions and consensus. Ethan was not a problem. My son was a person, a student, a citizen like any other. But Linda didn't see that. I knew she wouldn't stop until she got her way. And in a few weeks, this silent war would explode into a public confrontation before the whole community. That morning started like any other, but I had no idea that it would be the turning point that turned everything into a public battle. Ethan woke up at 5:30 as usual, took his medicine, did his physical therapy exercises, and had breakfast. I helped him check his wheelchair before heading out. It was working fine, the engine was running smoothly, everything seemed to be going smoothly. But as soon as I opened the door and pushed Ethan out, I noticed something was different. Linda stood in front of the house across the street, watching us. Beside her, a young assistant held a professional camera. As soon as we appeared, he raised the camera, pointing it straight at Ethan. My instincts were immediately alert. No one would film a child going to school without any intention. Anxiety rose, but I pushed Ethan out onto the sidewalk, trying to act like nothing had happened. The bus arrived on time, its distinctive yellow lights flashing around the corner. The driver, Mr. Wilson, flashed his usual smile, which eased my tension somewhat. He waved at Ethan, asking in a warm voice, "Ready for your chemistry test today?" Ethan smiled, nodded, and guided the wheelchair to the lift. I helped him into position, checked the wheel locks, and pressed the activation button. The hydraulic mechanism operated. gently lifting Ethan up to the bus door. A bang sound broke the familiar moment. Linda pushed the door open, striding across the street with an angry look. Her suit was still perfect, but her neatly combed hair was a bit messy, reflecting her haste. Her lips were pressed tightly together and her hand gripped the clipboard like a weapon. I didn't need to hear what she was going to say. "This is unacceptable." Her voice was sharp, and it echoed throughout the bus. I glanced quickly at the window. The kids had their faces pressed against the glass, some of them holding up their phones to film. A feeling of unease rose in me. Linda wanted this to be recorded. Every morning we have to see this. A bus blocking the entire street, disrupting traffic in the entire neighborhood. This can't go on, Linda continued, her voice as clear as if she were on a campaign podium, not in the middle of a street where a 15-year-old boy was just trying to get to school. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "It took us less than 2 minutes. This is a school bus, completely legal," I said, trying to contain my anger. Linda sneered, shaking her head. "It's not the time, it's the image it creates. Do you know how many people complain? This neighborhood needs to maintain a certain standard. We can't have these disruptions every day." I froze. Her words, though not directly stated, made it clear that Ethan was not a person in her eyes, but an interruption, an image problem that needed to be eliminated to keep the neighborhood looking perfect. Ethan was still sitting on the lift, his hands clenched on the controls. I could see his body tense, his eyes drooping. He was trying to make himself small, to be invisible. Something inside me broke. I couldn't take it anymore. "You're talking about image?" I emphasized each word, my voice low and sharp. "So let me clarify the image you're creating. A powerful woman publicly shaming a disabled child for needing a special ride to school. Do you want me to help spread that image?" Linda's face hardened. She noticed the phones rolling, but instead of backing down, she leaned in, her voice low but threatening. "Don't think you can challenge me. I have power you can't imagine." She turned, signaled her assistant to stop filming, and walked away without another word. But I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Because I saw the look in her eyes as she left, and I knew that Linda Matthews had never lost a battle she truly wanted to win. Little did I know that in Linda Matthews's attempt to control the conversation, she had inadvertently provoked a wave of resistance that she could not have foreseen. The incident at the bus stop that day was more than a simple confrontation. It was a catalyst for those around me who had been silent for too long to begin speaking out. As the bus pulled away and Linda turned to leave, I stood still in the middle of the street, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. The anger was still there, but mixed with helplessness. I saw Ethan's eyes as my son withdrew, as if his very existence were a mistake. That hurt more than any of Linda's words. But before I could sink into thought, a voice spoke softly behind me. What a shame. I turned to see Eleanor Chang walking slowly down her porch, her cane tapping lightly on the concrete. I knew she had lived here for years, but we had never spoken much beyond greetings. Today her eyes were determined, and I realized she had seen it all. "You're not alone in this," she said simply, then held up her phone, the video app still open. It wasn't until I sat in Eleanor's living room that evening that I fully understood what she meant. She hadn't just filmed the confrontation that morning. She and a group of other neighbors had been quietly collecting evidence of Linda Matthews's behavior for weeks. "I was a human rights lawyer before I retired," she said, her voice calm but sharp, setting the phone down on the table. "I've seen too many people like Linda, people who use their power to force others into their own mold, and the only way to bring them down is with hard evidence." She tapped the screen a few times, then handed me the phone. There were a series of videos, all with the same theme. Linda Matthews had been stalking Ethan for weeks. The videos came back, revealing a truth I had never realized. Linda stood at a distance, clipboard in hand, taking notes as Ethan boarded the bus. She took photos from different angles, filming the elevator with a calculating look in her eyes. Another video showed her talking to a man in a suit, whom Eleanor identified as Linda's political advisor. Both pointed to Ethan in a distant photo. "She has a private file on your son," Eleanor said, her voice cold. "We have collected over 20 photos and videos of her monitoring Ethan, and I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg." I picked up my phone, scrolling through the photos and videos, anger rising inside me. This was no longer morning traffic, as Linda had pretended, but systematic harassment, a carefully planned scheme. What angered me most was the way she saw Ethan as an obstacle, a tool for manipulating public opinion, rather than a child with legitimate rights. But I wasn't the only one angry. Eleanor didn't act alone. She had assembled a group of neighbors who had been watching the scene and secretly recording Linda's every move. When I looked up, I saw David from across the street, the Johnsons, and even Mr. Rodriguez, who I had always thought didn't care about anything but his garden. They were sitting there waiting for me, their eyes fixed. When I returned home that night, I knew Linda Matthews had made the biggest mistake of her political career. She had thought she could operate unnoticed. But now the entire neighborhood was staring at her, and this time she couldn't hide. The HOA meeting was Tuesday night, but the neighborhood had been unusually tense since morning. Looking out the window, I saw neighbors huddled in small groups, exchanging meaningful glances. A sense of quiet anticipation hung over Willow Creek, as if everyone knew something big was coming tonight. Linda Matthews might have thought she was still in control, but this time the tables had turned. I spent the day preparing not only mentally but also materially. The evidence from Eleanor Chang and the neighbors was not just illegal surveillance video of Linda and Ethan. They also collected documents about suspicious spending in the HOA fund, invoices for community projects that were actually for Linda's campaign. Every penny was spent to promote her image, under the guise of neighborhood improvement. It turned out that what Linda called community standards were just a cover for her plan to turn Willow Creek into her own political launch pad. I arrived at the community center 30 minutes early, but the room was packed. Neighbors who had been indifferent to Linda's injustice were all there. No one spoke loudly, but the tension was evident on every face. Eleanor sat near the front row, her phone ready to record the meeting. David leaned against the wall with his arms folded, his eyes cold. And in the center, full of power, was Linda Matthews. She was dressed like a politician about to address her constituents, not an HOA president facing the community she had long manipulated. A large screen was ready, a PowerPoint presentation waiting to be displayed. I anticipated the content, the charts, the twisted figures, the carefully selected images to reinforce her argument. Linda never let anything happen by accident. Everything had a purpose. "We'll begin." Her voice rang out, sharp and certain. "As you know, I've received a lot of feedback from residents about morning traffic and the disruptions it causes to the functioning of the neighborhood. I believe it's time we take a reasonable approach to maintaining the quality of life we all want." Linda pressed a button, and the screen showed Ethan's bus stopping in front of my house. Below it were the words "traffic disruption with proposed solution of restricting specialized vehicles to residential areas." The room tensed immediately. Her voice was smooth, her speech carefully prepared. Linda didn't mention Ethan, didn't mention wheelchairs, but everyone understood the true purpose of these regulations. A good neighborhood should be uniform, unencumbered by elements that disrupt the flow of life. Linda emphasized each word, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for consensus. We must ensure that all residents follow reasonable rules to maintain community standards." A few people around me began to whisper. I knew it was time to act. I took a deep breath and stood up. "If we're talking about reasonable rules," I said, "then maybe we should look at some of the rules you've imposed on yourself." Eleanor clicked a button on her laptop. The screen changed from Linda's presentation to a video of her watching Ethan. Linda standing at a distance, taking notes. Linda taking pictures of the bus. Linda pointing at Ethan's picture with her political advisor. The room exploded. Murmurs turned to gasps of shock, then to open protests. Linda tried to stand, but at that moment, HOA Vice President Tom turned on a second screen. There was a list of recent HOA expenditures. The numbers didn't lie. Tens of thousands of dollars had been embezzled for community promotion activities, which were actually funding Linda's campaign. The room fell into chaos. Linda tried to say something, but no one was listening. Her former supporters exchanged skeptical glances, recognizing the manipulation. I looked at Linda for the first time since the war began. I saw confusion in her eyes. She had not seen this coming, and I knew from that moment on, her power in Willow Creek had begun to crumble. The atmosphere in the conference room became tense as the numbers rolled in. The scattered rumors were now confirmed by the HOA's official financial documents. Suspicious expenses, unclear invoices, and, most importantly, $75,000 topping the list. I looked around, watching the faces turn from shock to outrage. Residents who had trusted Linda, who thought she was running the community for the common good, were now faced with the undeniable truth. Linda Matthews had not only abused her power, she had stolen money from the community to fuel her political ambitions. On the screen, each expense item was clearly displayed. Community image enhancement expenses were actually Linda's campaign posters and flyers. HOA event expenses were donor meetings. Residential development projects were edited promotional photos that removed any trace of people like Ethan's existence. Linda had turned Willow Creek into her political stage, and we residents were just supporting actors in her drama. I glanced at Linda. She was stiff, her eyes blinking rapidly as if searching for an escape route. For years, she had been accustomed to manipulating the HOA, accustomed to no one challenging her power. But this time she had misjudged. She thought she could easily crush me, push Ethan into the shadows, and continue to paint a perfect neighborhood in the eyes of voters. But it was that arrogance that led to her downfall. The evidence continued to pile up. Tom, who had quietly supported Linda, was now the one exposing her wrongdoing. When people questioned her about the suspicious spending, he pointed to a single invoice, claiming it was directly related to the company that funded Linda's campaign. No one could deny the truth anymore. Linda had turned the HOA into a personal financial vehicle, abusing her power not only to impose her own rules, but also to gain political favor. She wanted not only to remove Ethan from the neighborhood, but also to make children like my son a symbol of the burden she had pledged to eliminate from her public policy. That was the moment I realized Linda Matthews' true cruelty. She saw Ethan not as an obstacle, but as a tool for her campaign. She deliberately made my son's bus ride an example of inconvenience caused by excessive government regulation. Ethan was not a person in her eyes, not a student, not a small citizen of the neighborhood. To Linda, my son was just a symbol to be used to gain votes. The anger in the room exploded. Those who had been silent, who had believed in Linda, were no longer calm. "You used our money to run your campaign?" a woman exclaimed, horrified. "You thought we would never find out?" a man whispered, unable to believe his eyes. Linda tried to take control of the situation, standing up, her hands clenched on the table, her face turning from panic to anger. "This is all a misunderstanding," she declared, but no one believed her. She argued, trying to refute the obvious. But I looked around and knew the decision had been made. Linda Matthews no longer had power here. I looked at Eleanor, and she nodded. We had done it. We had pulled back the curtain, exposing Linda to the neighborhood. No more flowery words, no more manipulation, just the bare truth. An ambitious woman using the residents she was sworn to protect to further her political agenda. When Linda realized she had lost control, she turned to me, her eyes filled with hatred. She didn't need to say a word. I knew what she was thinking. She didn't believe she could lose, but she had, and everyone in the room knew it. Linda Matthews did not leave immediately, but everyone knew her time was up. The room, once filled with angry voices, fell into an awkward silence. Linda stood there, her hands clenched on the table, as if clinging to her last shreds of power. But the eyes that were directed at her were no longer filled with respect or fear, only with betrayal, anger, and disappointment. No one supported her anymore. No one. The first to stand was Tom, the HOA vice president, who had once followed Linda without question, but today his face was heavy, as if he had just awakened from a manipulated dream. "I propose an immediate vote of no confidence." His words did not need repeating. A few people nodded, and then the room began to stir. Those who had been silent before Linda's power now spoke up, as if they were regaining their own voices. The vote was quick, but Linda knew the result before the hands went up. I saw it in her eyes, the defeat slowly drowning out her usual pride. The result? 100% in favor of impeachment. Even her most loyal allies didn't dare to hold her back, because to side with Linda now was to ruin her reputation. She wanted to protest but stopped. Perhaps, for the first time in her life, Linda had no excuses. She had lost not only her position as HOA president, but also her political future. But just as Linda was about to pack up her documents, trying to preserve her last shred of dignity, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "It's not over yet." I turned to see Officer Jenkins step up from the back seat. He was a quiet man who usually kept his distance from HOA squabbles, but tonight he came not as a neighbor, but as an enforcer. "Based on the evidence you've presented," he said slowly, "I'm going to report this to the city's Financial Investigation Department. $75,000 in misuse is not something that can be ignored." Linda paled. For the first time all evening, her composure was gone. "You're trying to destroy me," she hissed, her voice losing its control. "This is a political witch hunt. I've done more good for this neighborhood than anyone." No one responded. No one believed her excuses anymore. I watched as Linda hastily gathered her papers, her hands shaking as she stuffed them into her bag. She was no longer the confident woman who had walked into the room an hour ago. Now she was a failure, someone who had just been exposed to the entire community she once controlled. Linda left the meeting in silence, not looking at anyone, not saying a word. As she walked through the door, I realized something. No one was walking her out. No one stood up to defend her. She had truly lost everything. The consequences for Linda didn't stop there. The next day, the news spread quickly. A local newspaper headline read, "HOA president resigned after embezzlement, abuse of power allegations." The same reporters who had helped her build her image were now exposing the truth. Linda Matthews's campaign collapsed almost immediately. Donors withdrew, political promises disappeared, advisors quickly distanced themselves. No one wanted to be associated with a corrupt man. But most importantly, Linda Matthews could no longer hurt Ethan. That night I stood in front of the house, watching Linda's lights still on, but without the pride. I didn't gloat over her downfall, just relief. Not because Linda was gone, but because the whole neighborhood had stood up and said, "We're not going to take this anymore." Willow Creek was no longer Linda Matthews's political theater. It was a real community again, where my son and all those like him had the right to exist without being seen as a problem. When Linda Matthews disappeared from the HOA, Willow Creek began to change. No more controlling notes on people's doorsteps, no more cold stares at Ethan's bus every morning, no more political HOA meetings. The days that followed passed in a strange silence, a silence not of fear or tension, but of something new, something I didn't think I'd see after all this. Unity. It all started small. Eleanor Chang proposed a new committee in the HOA to support accessibility for people with disabilities and promote inclusion. The idea quickly caught on. The biggest surprise, Ethan was invited to be the first member. My son, who had quietly avoided the spotlight, was now someone the community wanted to listen to. At first, Ethan wasn't sure he could do it. He kept to his old habits, trying to hide himself and avoid other people's eyes. But then, when neighbors proactively asked for his opinions on how to make the neighborhood more wheelchair-friendly, I saw him change, not through eloquent speeches or grand actions, but through small things. The way Ethan held his head higher when talking, the way he no longer hesitated to share his thoughts, the way he gradually understood that he was not a problem, but an important part of this community. Soon, small meetings at Eleanor's house turned into real discussions about how to make Willow Creek more inclusive. Some residents donated money to add sidewalk ramps. Others proposed improving traffic signals near the school to make it easier for students like Ethan to cross the street. What had once been seen as a burden became a shared goal for the entire community. And it wasn't just Willow Creek that was changing. A week after the HOA meeting, I got a call from Ethan's principal. At first, I worried that it might be a hangover from Linda's complaints, but she wasn't calling to warn me. She was calling to thank me. Ethan's story had spread, and it had caught the attention of the school board. The Board of Education began to ask how many other students in the entire district were struggling like Ethan, but no one was standing up for them. And from that simple question, a major change began. An emergency meeting was held among the school boards in the area. They reviewed the entire transportation and access system for students with disabilities. The documents that the HOA had used against Ethan, the bus photos and notes, were now evidence of a larger problem. The entire district's bus system was reviewed, leading to a major change. The policy on transportation for students with special needs was not only Ethan, but dozens of other students in the area now had more convenient and safe transportation. Ethan was no longer just a boy struggling for acceptance. He was now an inspiration for real change. And then, one weekend afternoon, as I stood on the porch, Ethan wheeled up to me, his eyes shining with a confidence I had never seen before. "Dad, I want to do more." I smiled, without asking what he meant. I knew Ethan had found his voice.